it's all being done quite deliberately and quite strategically. And it's because of the use of visual imagery, and these are symbolic representations of something to invoke particular responses. They have this kind of magical character. You have to be careful with it when people are forming little groups of people who know the secret truth of the faith in a way that other people can't understand. That's when you get into this kind of magical way of thinking, which just doesn't make sense. They know they're enchanted, and they know what unhealthy enchantment is. They know better than any generation what unhealthy enchantment is. They know what unhealthy, incredibly affecting and negatively impactful images consistently portrayed over and over again through digital technology. They know what effect that has on people.
Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Catherine Bennett.
And I'm Mark Lambert.
And here's Jacob Phillips, our friend Jacob Phillips, a professor at St Mary's Catholic University and expert in, well, I always think Benedict XVI. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm working on Benedict XVI at the moment. Yeah, whether I really qualify as an expert or not might be open to question, but that's certainly what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and you've written Obedience is Freedom, which is a book I recommend everyone reaches out to get. It's brilliant. Well, Jacob, you've written a couple of pieces for Catholic Unscripted, and the latest was on enchantment and disenchantment. This idea that at the moment, Rod Dreher's written this piece, Living in Wonder, and we hear a lot of talk about enchantment, re-enchantment. You're here to tell us a bit more, to pick that apart and tell us a bit more about your article.
Yeah, sure. So I find the re-enchantment debate very interesting, and I'm generally supportive of it and the need for re-enchantment as it's normally understood, which is people considering disenchantment to mean everything that's happened after the Enlightenment, modern science, perhaps liberal democracy, and people losing a sense of how the world is imbued with wonder and profundity and meaning and saturated with the divine at every moment of its existence. And obviously I love to see those things come back, and I really like the fact that people are talking about it and that it's capturing people's imaginations. I do think that within that conversation, it's worth just posing the question of, or making the point clear that it's not, being enchanted isn't necessarily good. It depends what you're being enchanted by. Simply being enchanted can be, people can be enchanted by all kinds of things. So I think although Protestantism has, as you say, kind of tended to tend toward disenchantment in a way that's completely detracts from the richness and the fullness of the Christian faith, ultimately, I still think within Catholicism there is an element of disenchantment, as in getting right with the real and with the truth, and clearing away healthy and unhelpful and false enchantments. And the way the word, when it's originally coined, it's used by Max Weber, who came up with this idea of enchantment and disenchantment, or he gave it that language. Originally, he talks about disenchantment as something that happens in the Old Testament with the prophets, challenging paganism and such like, and saying that we can't have these images and these symbols to try and entrap otherworldly forces and get them to do what we want to do, and surrendering everything to the God who has all power. So disenchantment was actually also about healthy and proper enchantment by that which should rightly enchant us, if you like, by the one God. And I would say this continues with Christ as well, and everything St. Paul says about triumphing over the powers and principalities. And therefore, disenchantment in its original meaning isn't just about sort of losing sight of everything and becoming secular and materialistic. Originally, it's about putting spiritual truth in the foreground and not being led astray by strange otherworldly forces that we shouldn't really be in contact with.
There's a whole dimension to that about names as well that I love that you brought that in, and this need, like that in the ancient world, wasn't it the case that if something had your name, that it's got a power over you in some way? And can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's a very rich tradition in the Old Testament, really going right back to Adam being given authority to name all the creatures in earth, unfallen Adam. So in our prelapsarian state before the fall, this sense of dominion over the earth is connected to the God-given ability to name the creatures of the earth. And naming after the fall becomes a problem, and it becomes associated with having an unhealthy relationship with things, or an unhealthy dominion with things. And then the tradition kind of reaches this point of climax, really, in Exodus 3, when Moses asks for the name of God, and God speaks this incredibly important answer, which is normally translated as "I am who I am," or I will be who I will be, and is a strange compound form of words, including the verb for to be, or the noun for being, something like that. And in the Jewish tradition, of course, this name was considered to be unpronounceable, and it was held that if anyone were able to pronounce it correctly, the cosmos would collapse, the sky would cave in, because it's a name of such power. And I would say it would be such an affront, the idea of a human being thinking that they can name God and have that sort of power over God, which God gives to unfallen Adam to have over the creatures of the earth. And this is why it's signified, sort of transliterated in YHVH, or Yod Hey Vav Hey in Hebrew, or what's given vowels in English as Yahweh. So that whole tradition of the name there, and then this is really important in the person of Christ. When Christ comes, Jesus Christ is the name of God. And in the high priestly prayer in John 17, he makes continual reference to having given God's name to the disciples. And that name is Jesus, and this is what he represents. And it's within this people, this tradition, this Jewish tradition, a tradition in which it was felt you couldn't even speak the name of God. A human being came along and said, "I am," using exactly those words. I am, that use of being to describe himself. Before Abraham was, I am. So that in a way that's connected to this disenchantment debate, because what that's doing is clearing away all the use of naming and power over all these otherworldly forces which are rife in the ancient world, and all the struggles that the Israelites had in the Old Testament to just accept God and not keep trying to manipulate or get technique over things with golden calves and surrendering to the Baal and all that kind of stuff. It clearing all that away and saying, this is the name, this is what can and should enchant you, and this is the one who has all power. And this is why it's in the letter of John, test spirits. Any spirit you encounter, ask them if they accept Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, and you'll know immediately to the way such a spirit responds what that spirit's about. And I would say the same applies to human beings. We're sort of spiritual intelligences in a way. To this day, speak the name of Jesus and see what happens. See the way people react. It's never a word.
There's so much to unpack there. I think it's really good. Like that. So, the whole disenchantment thing. I always remember learning that it was and it's something that I'm sort of proud of to this day about Christianity, is the way that we saved the pagans from that magic, if you like, that sort of. So that's the disenchantment thing in a way, isn't it? Is that Christ comes in and you don't have to worry anymore about being cursed, or because the name of Jesus has power over those spirits. But then, like you mentioned there the I am sayings. Can you help us a little bit with the ego eimi in Greek, isn't it? It's not, so obviously the Gospels are written in Koine Greek, so it's ego eimi, and that is Jesus taking on that name, the tetragrammaton, in a way, isn't it? But his name is Yeshua, which is God saved. So and then he's sort of proclaimed as Emmanuel, God with us. So how do all those things play together?
Well, there's all these different titles of Jesus which were around in his lifetime, and which either originate with him or with in prophecies and such like, and they all have different resonances and took on different meanings, all of which help us try and get a bit closer to trying to understand who he is in different communities and things like that. I am, ego eimi, is the highest possible way of words which could be used within a Greek-speaking Jewish context like that of St. John and those who were in community with St. John, who would have read the Old Testament in the Greek, the Septuagint, or would be familiar with it in the Greek, and therefore that name given in Exodus 3 would be ego eimi, something ego eimi. I can't remember exactly what it is. So that would immediately mean somebody's taking on language of the true word of the tetragrammaton and applying it to themselves as a divine name, which Jesus does 7 times in John's Gospel. So that's giving him the ultimate divine authority. It's incredibly audacious, mind-blowing thing in that context for a human being to use that phrase, referring it to themselves. Again, to be in a context, a religious context in which people couldn't even speak God's name, and to meet someone who would say that I am this God whose name you dare not speak, and that's what I am, has all that richness in it. So yes, it's about it's clearing away all the fear and the things that go with that paganism. I think you're right, all the curses and all this sense that people, they have something which can just break through all of that and deliver them. Another thing I'd say related to this and this whole disenchantment thing is, one thing I think that's often missing in the re-enchantment debate is it's just how enchanted people are today.
Yeah, that
in
was
the
a really
secular
good bit.
material world. I mean, people are profoundly enchanted, and I think in many ways more enchanted than, say my parents' generation, who, the slide into secular materialism was completely underway then in the 60s and 70s. But, if you want to see enchantment, watch a teenager spending 4 hours a day on TikTok. Symbols, images, just repeating themselves over and over again, transfixing them, pulling them into different ways of thinking. So the breaking through that comes with the real divine name, the proper divine name, should be something that can be applied to the unhealthy forms of enchantment that dominate culture today. And
scientism.
Sorry.
Oh no, sorry to interrupt. I was just thinking, it's easy to think of enchantment as angels and this fairy dust, but this kind of scientism is also a form of enchantment, isn't it?
Yeah, it is completely. Magic works by presenting a symbolic way to manipulate reality to your own advantage. This is exactly what science does. So science gives us things like the periodic table or formulae and stuff like that, and tells us how we can manipulate them to our own advantage in a way that's not necessarily wrong or unhealthy or anything, because there's much in modern medicine that we all need to be really grateful for. But it connects with magic in the sense that it tells us there's a more real dimension behind this one that we can control and manipulate however we want. And for all the good of modern medicine, we all know very well it has a lot of evil as well. And that ability to manipulate and control reality to your advantage through manipulating symbols that don't make sense to normal people. We can't really understand them unless we've had scientific and medical training, but through the use of things that can be seen on screens and knowledge of chemicals and all this kind of stuff and DNA, these processes can happen, which people can use, they are basically, it is really a form of magic. It's very similar to how magic was understood. So the idea that you can have kind of science versus enchantment doesn't make sense to me, and lots of people in this debate understand it. They understand this difference. So if you look at growth times when science began to take over, there is often also a growth in magic happening around the same time. They're very closely related. So Isaac Newton was fascinated by alchemy. His faith was basically a kind of, if you can call it faith, kind of Gnostic Arianism himself. So he was engaged with kind of magical practices. And in the late 19th century, when science was beginning to take over in Darwin, there was a massive explosion of occult esoteric activity going on at the same time. And then in the 1960s, when you got the whole New Age thing, science is taking hold even more, and materialism. The two often go hand in hand. It's not magic versus science. It's actually science and magic are, they're a little bit of a Venn diagram, I would say, actually, in the way that they work and the way they overlap. And again, this is why the disenchanting character, or what you might call the need for proper and true enchantment that comes through Catholicism, is the proper antidote to both, if they're not kept in check, I would say, both magic and science.
It's interesting because we've just come out of a period a few years ago where we've been told to trust the science. And I always remember Peter Kreeft talking about science. You can use medical skills for cosmetically enhancing a woman's breasts, or for helping the burns of a person who's been, it's the science itself is not the thing. It's like you say, what undergirds that? Is it the good? you know, the theory of relativity can be used to nuke Hiroshima, or it can be used for good. But if it's not undergirded by the good, then what does it even mean to say trust the science?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's true. It's, you know, it's kind of like saying trust a machine. You know, what do you do with it? You know, a laptop can be used for good things, it can be used for awful things. We all know that. And actually, thinking back to COVID and lockdown, I hadn't thought of it in this connection, but actually, it was first couple of weeks of lockdown here in the UK. It was in March. I mean, that was a kind of mass form of enchantment, and it used symbolic representation to manipulate people's responses the way they wanted it to be. So you had, I don't know if you remember, but all the news programs, TV, BBC, all had this sort of representation of the little virus. The coronavirus had a particular form with these spikes on, and you know, but actually that's not, you know, it's microscopic. It can't be seen by the human eye. It's been given a symbolic representation, blown up and kind of blowing across TV screens, and that manipulates people's behavior. Similarly, later on when they had, I don't know if you remember, like little animations where red dots were flying out of people's mouths and stuff like that. And they'd put a mask on and the red dots would all be going backwards, you know, complete nonsense. But really powerful, you know, the visual images affect the way people behave. And, you know, it's not full-blown idolatry, but it's working in the same way. It's using images and representations to manipulate behavior for certain ends, much of which we know, in the case of some of the craziness of lockdown, much of which we know now was science was completely faulty and shouldn't have been trusted at all in some cases.
In what way would we say this is a perversion of the icon?
I think that's exactly what it is, really. But it's kind of, I think in today's culture, it's quite subtle. It's quite low level. So it's, you know, these things aren't necessarily kind of worshipped and stuff, but it's the same. It's the principle of how visual representation causes really strong, effective responses in people. And through technology and digital technology, you know, people have become extremely skilled at understanding this stuff, which is like a kind of form of magic. It's a manipulation of neuroscience in the brain. So, you know, I was reading that when you scroll down on your notifications list on social media, and it has that little sort of tick, that little timer thing as it comes back up before the notifications pop up, how that was deliberately programmed to replicate the way in which fruit machines work. When you press the button and they have this boom, and you either get the dopamine or you don't. And it's kind of, it's all being done quite deliberately and quite strategically. And it's because of the use of visual imagery, and these are symbolic representations of something to invoke particular responses. They have this kind of magical character on people. And that's, you know, yeah, just something I think people need to be more aware of, that we are, you know, we're being chanted all the time. And, you know, if we're talking about healthy or unhealthy enchantment or dark or light enchantment, then it's by your fruits that you know it. You know, what are the fruits of these things? What effects are they having in people's lives? Magic tends to lead ultimately to what today would be called mental health issues and kind of loneliness, and a sense that reality is not the embodied world that we live in today, the world that Jesus walked in. True reality is behind this world somewhere, in some imagined world, some retreat into fantasy, and then people become really unhappy because they're not actually living fully engaged lives. That's what happens to people who get caught up in, you know, magic. And people involved in it tend to form little select groups and stuff, you know, groups of initiates or people who have the knowledge, and, you know, it affects even really subtly life in the Catholic Church. You get people who are like, you know, I'm not like normal Catholics. Like I know the real bit.
Secret formula
that other
like
people don't.
Yeah,
and you have to be careful with it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm very liturgically opinionated, like the rest of us, you know. But you know, I think you have to be careful with it when people are forming little groups of people who know the secret truth of the faith in a way that other people can't understand. That's when you get into this kind of magical way of thinking, which just doesn't make sense to me.
It's hugely ironic, isn't it, really, when you think about it, that there's like, I'm thinking of Chesterton, you know, saying it's not when people stop believing in God, it's not that they believe in nothing, it's that they believe in everything. And, you know, I've got members of my family. It's funny because we were talking about it earlier, Catherine, weren't we, that, you know, who was a Catholic and has taken on the New Age thing. And even though it's, you know, it doesn't matter what you say, it persists, if you know what I mean. Like, even if you sit down and have, you know, really reasoned conversation, it doesn't make any difference. There's still this incredibly, confident expression of, you know, angels and crystals and all that sort of thing at any family gathering. which is like, it is this sense that when you abandon the truth, then you're looking for, you'll basically believe any old rubbish, won't you? Which,
Yeah, completely. And we're in a different time to we were sort of 10, 12 years ago, when new atheism was really popular, and Richard Dawkins had done his book, it was all about, because it's much easier, I think, for people to realize today that for reason to function properly, it needs to be in complementary relationship with faith, or proper faith, or faith in God. And when reason is left kind of on its own, or in some way disconnected from God, it just runs itself into all kinds of silly ways of thinking, which can't be kind of rationally grounded or proved to themselves. And it's just so rife in the culture. I mean, someone in your family is talking about crystals at family gatherings, and the amount of times now in the everyday workplace, someone will say, well, something like, I think the universe is telling me something,
yes,
which is a bit like trust the science, isn't it? How can the universe tell you anything, really? And this stuff's become really normal, and just people saying, I don't relating to stuff with this kind of new age meets cod psychology language, which in and of itself is kind of meaningless. And if you went back like 50 years and said to someone, I don't know, I think the universe is telling me to say no to that, they would just think you're mental.
Yeah.
Just completely mental.
Do you think that is tied up then with the fact that we are the kind of creatures, it's part of our DNA that we are made to worship, and it matters what you worship, and if you're worshipping the wrong thing, then this is how it's all out of alignment. So they might have abandoned their faith in God, but they're created in a way that needs to sort of have some supernatural faith, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. Yeah. I mean, on a profound instinctive level, deep in our layers of conscience, we know that everything has come from a personal intelligence. It comes from a personal source. And when we're disconnected from that, we see the personality and all kinds of other things within the world, rather than as the cause of the world. Human beings will always personalize and enter into kind of relational contact with things they come into contact with, because everything ultimately has its source in the absolute personhood of God. And this is just the way people are. And if you cut off that connection to God, people will develop these very strange kind of things where they think the universe is telling them what to have for breakfast and stuff like that. It's exactly what happens. Or they just get transfixed by themselves. Their own individuality becomes the personality. So they're really, really kind of hard rationalist scientist. It's really difficult for them not to slip into a kind of enchanting self-centeredness, because the only kind of personality they really know intimately or can be in a relationship with is themselves, because it's the only one that's actually scientifically there for them in their own consciousness. The idea you can strip away having a personal relationship with reality is just something human beings can't really deal with, because we're structured for God.
That has
this
been
can be a real.
Sorry, Catherine. Go on.
No. Well, I was only going to say this can be a real opportunity for us as Christians, can't it, to take that and to say all those instincts, because it's easy to get annoyed by them and say, oh, Auntie Jones coming around with her crystals or whatever it is, but to say people who speak when somebody dies. I know people who don't go to church and don't have any relationship with God ostensibly, and when someone dies says, oh, he'll always be with you, he's walking next to you, and you just think, what does that even mean?
I think that's right. And death is a really good thing to bring in, because there are very, very, very few people in this world who can follow through their agnosticism or unknowing or atheism or anything like that, can actually follow it through the death of a loved one. There are very few people that can follow it through consistently in, as you say, in everyday language around death. Even the person who never seems to have given any thought to religion will be using phrases like those you mentioned, or so-and-so looking down on us, or they're with the angels now. Ricky Gervais is an exception to that. I mean, he does try and follow it through consistently, his hard new atheist mentality.
There's something a little bit admirable. There's something a bit admirable about that.
Yeah, and I do. I kind of respect Ricky Gervais, and I watched that series he did Afterlife to see if he manages to follow it through consistently, which I think he does really try to do. And there is, yeah, as you say, consistency there. But it's most people will be the kind of people that will be like, oh no, I haven't got any time for religion, and oh yeah, grandma's with the angels now, she's looking down on me and watching my every move, and making sure that the universe is nice to me. And you think, well, yeah, interesting. So yeah, there is an opportunity for us to enter into that, I suppose, rather than just sort of react to everything in a kind of negative way and see how it's functioning. But I also think, well, I think we're seeing this, really with the young today, and that they know they're enchanted. They know they're enchanted, and they know what unhealthy enchantment is. They know better than any generation what unhealthy enchantment is. They know what unhealthy, incredibly affecting and negatively impactful images consistently portrayed over and over again through digital technology. They know what effect that has on people. They know what it is to live in another world that's different from this embodied world that Jesus walked in. They know what it is to have your center of gravity in that world and be disconnected and lonely and unable to relate to this world properly. They know what it is to have little niche groups and online subcultures where everybody thinks they know the truth and everyone else has got it wrong. This is all just magical thinking, and they know it better than any other generation, I think.
Wow, that's quite powerful, isn't it? Surely that trajectory is the one that we've been on for some time. It's the one that's created the sort of trans movement, isn't it? That where our sexuality is the center and idol of everything that we are. And that surely is the dictatorship of relativism, isn't it? That Benedict warned us about, or the consummation of that idea.
Yeah, completely. And Benedict was, the dictatorship of relativism thing, I was thinking about the other day. It's such a prophetic move on his part to spot that in, what was it, 2004, 2005, I think he did the speech. Because when you actually unpick the statement, it doesn't make sense, because you're saying that there's an absolute relativism. It's a dictatorship. It's a totalitarian form of relativism. And what he foresaw that hardly anyone else did at that point was that if you make relativism an absolute, then it will become this really totalitarian way of looking at the world that doesn't actually make sense, because you're saying there's no such thing as absolute truth when that's an absolute truth. So it's this kind of really paradoxical world you'll enter into, which we saw a few years later in how that kind of moral relativism surfaced as kind of cancel culture and extreme wokeness and identity politics. That's what came from it. Was actually a new form of totalitarianism, a new form of dictatorship, a new form of control. And he foresaw that.
You're no longer allowed to assert truth, are you? You're no longer allowed to say what's true and what's false, because truth is something all of a sudden that's relative, and you've got your truth and I've got my truth, and don't impinge on my freedoms. It's craziness.
Exactly, it is, and they're exactly the people that are saying that have quite a facile understanding of right and wrong, which is enforced upon other people. So you can't say this, we can't really feel confident that this is true or that is true. And I saw this, I've worked with young people, so I've seen this happen. When you're teaching about this kind of thing and relativism and stuff, you'll often say to people, what's an example of something that everyone knows is morally wrong? Nice, easy starter for 10 with a group of young people. And it used to be that they say murder. And you'd be like, okay, good, right, starting point. And then one year I did it, and they said, anti-trans laws in Poland. And I thought, okay, all right, let's work with that. And I said, well, okay, let's work with that. So let's have a think about the Polish situation. They've had a lot of totalitarianism. They've been invaded by Russia. They've had Nazi Germany on the other side. Their Catholic identity is really kind of core to their nationhood. And therefore, from a Polish perspective, let's think about it relatively for the purpose of discussion. From a Polish perspective, you can understand why they might see transgender ideology as something having its origin in authoritarian forms of government from the EU and Western Europe and things like that. And they're very sensitive to that. And, the response was, no, it's completely wrong. Completely wrong. Cannot be discussed.
So an authoritarian.
The people were less relative. That's what I mean. They were less understanding of relativism. Exactly. So it's, and Benedict foresaw that, and it is connected with what we're talking about around disenchantment and enchantment, because if you don't accept an absolute, anything else can become an absolute. It's kind of what Chesterton's saying. If you stop believing in God, you believe in anything. You need God as the absolute. You need that stopgap to say this is the truth. there is no going beyond this point. This is the ultimate. This is the source of everything. You cannot get beyond me. You cannot get past me. I have all power and I have all love. And this is the truth, and this is the end, and I am the ultimate, the alpha and the omega. Then everything else can fall into order. If you don't have an alpha and an omega, then other things are going to take those places for you and become ultimates. And what does, magic is about manipulation of power, and power without love, ultimately. So how does it work? It looks at what is possibly the most impactful, instinctive form of power in human psychology and anthropology, which is the sex drive. The sex drive, which according to Catholic faith can only be ordered properly and expressed in accordance with God's will when it's intertwined with genuine love, love as self-offering. It takes that raw power, and in our culture today, that raw power can be completely stripped from any ordering by love and from concern for the other person as a genuine person, and just the expression of pure power. And again, if you go back 50 years and you talk about what people would consider kind of normal and natural in what goes on in the world of sexual desire, people just wouldn't be able to believe what young people are aware of today in terms of what people do to each other in the bedroom. And that's where it's kind of got us, really.
Yeah, and I find that absolutely fascinating as well, that it's become detached from its proper boundaries in terms of like the procreative and the unitive ends. Then it becomes something so dangerous. And do you think that young people, despite this sort of spiraling into this relativistic idea of the centrality of sexual identity and all these complex things that they've, like you say, the exposure to sexual images in a more profound way than any other generation before, is that when you said that they understand what it means, to be oppressed by these things in a way that no one has done before? Is that part of that? Is that what you're saying? That it's the sexual thing as well, and that's what's perhaps driving this turn towards more traditional forms of Christian worship for young people these days?
Yeah, I think so. If you look at the stats on what young boys are exposed to and at what age they're exposed to things through smartphones and stuff like that, they're seeing the most appalling expression of sex as loveless power than any other generation has been exposed to at such an age. So it's no wonder that they're searching for something which is true and meaningful and beautiful and good as an antidote to what they've been exposed to from the culture at large. And I think there's a definite relationship between those two things. And we all know it would seem to be young men who are more likely to convert at the moment than young women, certainly in the 18 to 25-year-old range. And when you look at the experience many of those men have had in approaching that age, I'm not surprised that they're looking for something that provides the antidote to all of that.
That's really interesting and profound, isn't it? Because once you reach the bottom of that experiential well, if you like where you're just, it's a hunger that you can't satiate. It's something like it's that sort of animalistic drive, and if you pursue it for a certain amount of time, you recognize how empty it is, and then you're looking for it's almost like we're seeing that trajectory and being reversed now, aren't we? That we've gone down as far as we can go down that well. And I have to say, I see the trans thing, and all of these arguments very much in that light, that how much further can we pervert the natural order in a way that is damaging to our society, and it feeds through into everything that we see in the culture that's poisonous and dangerous and fracturing. And it's amazing that you see then the human nature, which is ordered for God, pulling itself out and reaching up for the good, for the transcendental realities.
Yeah, completely. Thanks be to God, as St. Augustine said, God can always bring good out of evil. No matter what the evil is, God can turn it to something good. And I think we're beginning to see that now among the young to a certain extent. And you mentioned the trans thing, it's for someone who has an awareness of this kind of magical world or the history of these symbolic representations and stuff like that. You know, the hermaphrodite is a classic trope of magic that was fascinating to lots of people in Gnosticism. The idea that you know, the fall isn't a fall from grace; it was just a descent into matter. It didn't have a moral dimension for many of these Gnostics, and then part of the fall was the separation into male and female. So if someone could become both male and female, they were reaching this kind of prelapsarian state. There's all kinds of myths around this, and the symbol of that combines obviously Mars and Mercury, or Mars and Venus, in these alchemical symbols where male and female are combined into one symbol. All of these are used for particular identities in the trans movement. And these are like 14th, 15th century symbols from demonic grimoires for ritual magic. And even I've become completely accustomed to this. You actually just take a step back and think, look at the history of this symbol and what it means. And it's now on a pedestrian crossing in Trafalgar Square. On these, I don't know if you've seen those pedestrian crossings, but they've got pedestrians crossing. Instead of a green man, they've got the green kind of non-binary fairy symbol or whatever. And these are like literally symbols which were coined for the use of demonic ritual magic. And even if they're not, you know, they're very different today and they're not used in that kind of way, isn't it odd that you can walk through central London and see that emblazoned, you know, state-sponsored use of alchemical demonic imagery as something, as it always was presented, bringing liberation, freedom, meaning, purpose, which is exactly how evil always presents itself, as the good, the light bringer.
Which is why the antidote, I was talking to you recently, we were at a conference together, and increasingly in life and all the noise around us in life, you can more clearly see that it's humility. It's always pride versus humility. And humility in that sense of Mary's fiat of saying, I go under, you know, I place my life under you or in you. You know, it's that not wanting to grab, because all that spiritual stuff you're saying, you know, even Catholics who maybe seek to know a bit more than they need to know, or want to name their guardian angel, all of that is a kind of hubristic need to control and not relinquish our lives and say our lives belong to God, our children's lives belong to God, and we need to return to God and keep that as our focus. Even in the work we do, I've had people say to me in the last couple of days, what's your comment on the Pope blessing an iceberg? And of course it's ridiculous and amusing, but it's sometimes I feel like we're in danger of being drawn into, have you got the answers? Which is the right this? Which cardinal is best? We do need to be aware that, like you said, there are liturgy wars and everything else, and we've got opinions on it. But ultimately, do we just place ourselves at the feet of Christ? Do we focus on our own personal sanctity and try to help our children get to heaven and shut it off? Because I don't know how helpful it is to be drawn into that, because it's like you're looking to me for answers. Well, I'm not the answer. Mark's not the answer. The answer is always Christ. And so we can get puffed up if we think we've got the answer. I read something, one of the trad online was saying, we demand that the Pope this, and I think, who are we? I'm happy just not to hear from the Pope. I don't even want to know about him blessing an iceberg. You know, I wish I didn't have to know that. And whether I think it's good or bad is irrelevant. Just let the Pope get on being the Pope, and we don't need to comment on it. So all of this is to say that the eternal struggle is that between pride. So it's no wonder that the sexual movement has adopted pride as its mantra, and Our Lady's fiat and humility. And when you say, sorry, one more thing, when you say men are the ones now moving more into the traditional Christianity, I think that's true, but I think women will follow, because the deconstruction was, first men removed themselves from under God, revolted against God, and then feminism follows and the revolt against men. So the reordering is for man to place himself under God, both in the micro family and in the world at large, for man to say, no, I'm not above God, I place myself under him. And then the women will follow. The women will then be led by the men to place themselves under the the men, and that ordering will be right. So it's the right way round. I think it would be that way, that it's the men who are going first back, and then go the women.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it in terms of reminding ourselves of the pride, hubris distinction from humility, and as creatures with an inherent tendency to pride, even after baptism, that can manifest as a desire for a kind of pseudo divine absolute knowledge. And it's really interesting to apply that to church politics, because I like you know, I don't really need to know what the Pope had for breakfast. In fact, I'd rather not know what the Pope had for breakfast, because he might have something for breakfast I think a Pope shouldn't have for breakfast. And then instead of thinking about doing God's will today, I'm getting in a flap about what the Pope had for breakfast. And you know, I think Pope Leo seems to be someone who says a bit less than his predecessor, and that's a good thing. And one of the best things I saw, one of the best tweets I saw actually after Pope Francis died, was someone saying, just change the picture in the kitchen and move on. That's all we have to do. So yeah, I agree with that. And you know, magic is always about, well, as human beings, we're kind of prideful. We want to have the knowledge of good and evil. We want to have the absolute knowledge that belongs to God alone, and that's pride. And magic is always saying we can get into the beyond, we can transcend the beyond, we can fly in the beyond, we can do whatever we want, we can manipulate the beyond, and that can work just on the way of knowledge. And people being expected to have opinions on everything. There's a really interesting tradition in Franciscan spirituality about not having an opinion on stuff, which I just find fascinating. You know, like a good friar should not really have opinions on things. Which I try and fail to practice in my own life. We're all meant to have opinions on everything. And the way things work, you know, with AI and the internet and stuff, is people who get this kind of gotcha mentality. It comes up in universities. They're like, you know, I'll come up with the question that the lecturer can't answer. And you think, well, you're a theologian. Of course you can't answer the questions. You know, that's the wise man in theology is a person who's always willing and ready to say, I do not know. And that's, again, it's what that ordering of what God brings to the human self, is that the ultimate truth is fundamentally unknowable, infinitely unknowable, because it far transcends anything you can ever imagine, and that's God, which then puts everything in its proper place, if that's properly kind of accepted and reflected upon. And people will say about AI, there's this wonderful thing, it can answer every question. We should be really wary of stuff which can answer every question, you know. Jesus rarely directly answered questions. You know, Moses would never have said he could answer every question, because he asked questions and was told it's not to you to know the answer to that. You know, it's people that claim they can answer every question that we need to be really worried about. And that's exactly what AI is. I can answer every question.
Well, we've run to 44 minutes, and there's so much I'd love to get into with you, including your own conversion story, because you're not, like me and Mark, a cradle Catholic, but conscious of your time, perhaps we can make a plan to meet and have a part 2 and discuss that with you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, happy to discuss it and be the convert. You know, converts are there's a lot of us about these days. You know, but we can never have that wonderful unbroken trajectory of being baptized an infant that you have yourselves.
I was just looking
at a lovely rivalry that we have going on between us.
I was just looking at Peter Kreeft again. He's been writing about it. He's, you know, his own conversion. Chesterton says there's 2 ways of coming home, of getting home. One is to stay there, and one is to walk around the whole world until you come back to the same place. And then he says, and then there's a 3rd way, which is to discover it for the first time. And talks about his conversion. And it's really beautiful. And I do think, you know, that Mark and I, when you first came on, said, I told Mark, because I don't think he knew that you're a convert, and he went, oh, he's a convert. It's often the converts who are showing the rest of us up, aren't they, Mark?
Well, and that was the context that I meant it in, really. Yeah. There's been a big argument with Austin Ivory and all these people, isn't there, where they've been saying, oh, it's the converts who are causing the trouble. That's really what I was getting at. Yeah. Was the fact that, you know, it's often the converts who are the most informed, who care about it the most, and are able to explain it best, you know, and to the detriment of people like Austin Ivory, who, you know, think that they're better than everyone else, sort of thing, for some obscure reason. So that was really what I was getting at.
I remember that exchange a few years ago now, wasn't it? Yeah.
Sorry,
We're calling. Yeah. Wasn't it?
Your line is bad, Jacob. What you've said is brilliant, but your line is bad, which is why it's difficult to judge the time for not talking over each other and but I can edit little gaps and stuff. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much, Jacob, for joining us. And do please, I hope this conversation has encouraged you to want to go and read that article on our website, catholicunscripted.com. It's brilliant, and I hope you'll come back and join us again soon. But for now, thanks for watching. I'm Catherine Bennett.
And I'm Mark Lambert.